know that you think you're the coolest one in town, but to me you'll be much cooler when you're 6 feet underground. Some of us are crazy, some are smart and brave. Well, it doesn't really matter, we all end up in the grave. All my favorite people are dead. All my favorite people are dead. I'm saying all my favorite people are dead. 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 Well, hello there, folks, and welcome to another episode of All My Favorite People Are Dead. Yes, so we've been covering quite a few interesting dead people thus far. Some girls, some guys, some mostly wealthy people. Except the guys on the Titanic. They were worker bees. They weren't terribly wealthy. This next character was actually at one point one of the highest paid people in the entire world. And that was by the age of 26, which is quite impressive. Now, he's been known as many different things. The little man, the little fellow, the tramp. This is a character, really. Just a character who was played by the great genius, Charlie Chaplin. Now, the real Charlie Chaplin, by the way, it's an excellent documentary. I was just watching it. Very good. I just read the book Tramp, The Life of Charlie Chaplin by Joyce Milton. Also amazing. Couple of recommendations there for you. There's been a ton of stuff written about this man, said about this man, documented about him. He's a complicated guy, complex, right? And a lot of the characters that we talk about are complex. If you're not complex, then you're probably just really boring. And then there's no reason for us to talk about you, is there? Yeah. So anyway, so there's some ups and downs in Charlie Chaplin's life, right? We're going to get into that in a second. But you've probably, if you don't know the name, you certainly know the image of the tramp that he created. The mustache is very distinctive, the hat, the cane, the baggy pants, the big oversized roughed up shoes. Those are all things that we know very well in the image of the tramp. But Charlie Chaplin was so much more than just the tramp, as we will discuss in this episode of All My Favorite People Are Dead. So join me, won't you, as we take a look at Charlie Chaplin. Born on April 16th, 1889, Charles Spencer Chaplin came about during the reign of Queen Victoria. That year, the Eiffel Tower was built. Film was just beginning to be created in a moving format. Charlie was born to parents who had both been performers, Hannah Hill Chaplin and Charles Chaplin Sr., who apparently left Hannah alone to raise her two boys. This included another son from another encounter, Sidney. This would be Charlie's older half-brother. Now, poor Hannah, Charlie's mother, was trying to take care of her boys in the Kennington section, the poor section of London, and times were tough. The boys grew up mostly begging on the streets, wearing rags, and the pressure of this did not help Hannah's mental health. She sent her boys to the Lambeth Workhouse for Children, which was an incredibly tough place for the boys to grow up. She would try to reunite the family, but would fail again, and finally, under the weight of it all, she was sent to an asylum in 1898. Charlie and his brother Sid also spent time in the Hanwell School for Orphans and Destitute Children, known as the Cuckoo Schools. Could you imagine going to something referred to as the Cuckoo School? Yeah. Is it anything like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? Anyway, so the first 10 years of his life were quite the struggle. And he told himself that he would be rich someday and never have to deal with any of this ever again. Well, we all tell ourselves that, don't we? Someday I'll be rich and not have to struggle. But Charlie actually managed to pull this off. And he did it by playing the role of the little man who struggles in life. Ironic, isn't it? The poor man who manages to make his way through life, stealing, pranking, tricking anyone who was above him, upper class, the establishment, law enforcement, and he finds a way. Charlie began his career on the vaudeville stage when he was very young. He actually had taken over for his mother's stage act on one occasion when he was 5. Her voice was failing her, so he jumped up on stage and took over the show. If you've ever seen the 1992 film Chaplin, starring Robert Downing Jr., you see this scene right in the beginning. And it's true. It actually happened. Through his father's connections, Chaplin became a member of a young boys' clog dancing troupe. And he toured the English music halls throughout 1899 and 1900. He didn't want to just dance, however. He had always been funny. Since his childhood, he used to make the kids on the streets of Kennington giggle and laugh at him. And purposely. This is something that he did because he wanted to. He enjoyed it. He was good at it. He wanted to be a stage comedian. He played a drunk man pretty well. He worked in various stage performances before joining up with his brother Sidney with Fred Carno's comedy company. Now, it wasn't quite a sure thing at first, as Carno wasn't really impressed with this little, pale, scrawny guy, but that quickly changed when his comic abilities became obvious, and by 1909, both of the brothers were in a show, and they could even afford a comfortable flat in London. Things were changing for the both of them. For the first time, they didn't have to worry about where their next meal was coming from, although Charlie, strangely enough, always would. He would always fear poverty. No matter how wealthy or famous he became, he would always have that fear that he could end up on the streets again, or in that dreadful attic apartment where he and his brother and mother had known poverty for far too long. Now, he did tour around a bit at this point in his life. He taught himself the cello, ancient Greek, and he also began the practice of yoga during these touring days. It was also at this point that he began to form crushes on young women. Interesting fact that I read about him, he was not attracted to breasts, which explains why he only married teenagers. Even in his later years, which is a bit creepy, and I guess all geniuses are a bit creepy in their own ways, but okay, I digress. So, he had some early relationships with some fellow stage performers, but in the end, he had to perfect his work and get rich. No girl, no matter how small her titties were, was going to stand in the way of that goal. But there were times when he wasn't always doing so well, and briefly considered other careers. For example, he contemplated hog farming in Oklahoma and exporting cheese to China. I think the whole world is better off because he decided against these things, and instead, Fred Carno's company toured to the United States in 1910, and Charlie got his first chance to see the States up close. He came back home to find that Sid had married and sold the flat where they had been living, along with the furniture that they had. He was a bit broken-hearted by that. So he went back out on tour and then back to the States. This time, he got the opportunity to work in the film business when Keystone Studios was looking to replace their comedic star, Fred Mace. Charlie was offered $150 a week, which was far more than he had ever earned in vaudeville. He was working for a man named Max Sennett, and sadly, for Sennett, he never really realized Chaplin's full potential. He did not appear in film until February 2nd, 1914, and not as the Tramp quite yet. His first film was Making a Living. Ironic title to begin his career. He plays a swindler. But just to show you how fast these guys were popping out films in those days. Now, granted, they weren't very long or technical, nor did they really have the most complicated character development, or overall they were just a little bit crude and rough around the edges. Anyway, on February 14th, 1914, the Tramp appears for the first time in the next film, Kid Auto Races at Venice. He was an immediate success and would continue to appear in Chaplin's films for the next quarter of a century. Side note, did you know that the baggy pants that the Tramp wears were actually a pair of actor Fatty Arbuckle's pants? And the hat that belonged to Fatty Arbuckle's father-in-law. Charlie grabbed them while putting together the look that would become one of the most famous and most imitated characters of all time, the Tramp. Oh, another side note. Did you know there was a knockoff guy named Charlie Chaplin? Yeah, that's right. He was making films in the 1920s that looked exactly like Chaplin's. He claimed he was actually imitating Billy West, another silent film actor, and not Charlie Chaplin. But then why call yourself Charlie Chaplin? His actual name was Charles Amador. Like, dude, come on. It's like Vanilla Ice claiming he didn't lift the bass line from Under Pressure for Ice Ice Baby. Ugh. Anyway, all of these guys were inspired by the actual tramps that were roaming the country searching for food, work, and lodgings. But Charlie's Tramp, Charlie Chaplin, not Applin, ugh, Charlie's Tramp was so unique in his mannerisms, and Applin was just plain hijacking them. And the look, even the mustache. Dude, couldn't you at least get a different mustache? No. That's just lame. Anyway, Chaplin was offered a wild amount of money by Annecy Studios in Chicago, about $1,250 a week, which he signed on to in December of 1914. But by December of 1915, Mutual Studios was offering him $10,000 a week. He was considered the highest paid man in the world and was a whopping 26 years old. He built himself a studio, created a cooperative of artists known as United Artists, as it still is today, with fellow actors like D.W. Griffith, Mary Pickford, and Douglas Fairbanks, his good friend. By 1919, Chaplin was controlling every aspect of his films. He wrote the scripts, he did the filming, posed the actors, he composed the scores, he plans the wardrobes, the makeup, he edits the films himself. Someone once said that Charlie if he had the ability to, he would do everything himself. And he absolutely would. Now, when it comes to major scandals, particularly with his love life, the first real one took place before his first major film came out. And this was with a 16-year-old actress, very young actress, named Mildred Harris, who Chaplin had managed to, let's say, get knocked up. He quietly married her, but when their son died 3 days after he was born, the relationship got worse. Not that it was ever really that good to begin with. So, they divorced. Now, Mildred Harris claimed that Chaplin had been cruel to her. Most of his marriages would start and end like this, including his marriage to Leda Gray, who wrote openly about how nasty Chaplin could be. And if anything got in the way of his work, including his wives, they were steamrolled by him and his fans. Of course, none of us will know the extent of his love life and just who was right and wrong, but it does beg the question. If a man is considered a genius and is loved by the world, Do the women in his life even stand a chance to tell their side of the story? Or will they be ignored, or worse, referred to as liars or whores or gold diggers? Who would we believe? The beloved genius or the woman who tried to love him? Tough one, huh? Anyway, his first major film, which took 9 months to finish and stood at a whopping 68 minutes long, was The Kid. And it co-starred a 4-year-old named Jackie Coogan. This is actually my favorite of Chaplin's films. It has all the feels. You laugh, you cry, you're held in suspense. There's a dream sequence, a few good fighting and action shots. It really does have it all. For a film that doesn't have anyone speaking, you never lose track of what's going on. And that's the beauty of Chaplin's films. You always know what's going on. And you can even relate to his characters. You can particularly relate to the Tramp. And I think this was his whole idea to begin with, to have a character that the simple people could relate to. Charlie is entering a part of his life where his movies are more complicated, they're longer, and even take much longer to complete. The Gold Rush, City Lights, which drove most of the crew and actors crazy with his desire to get just one scene right. I think it took like 500 takes or something ridiculous like that, just to get one scene right, although it was the most important scene of the film, where the blind woman who's trying to sell flowers confuses the Tramp for a millionaire because she hears a door of a fancy car slam just as he's coming by. It's a very, very moving scene, and you really start to understand what's going on, but he couldn't get it right. At least that's what he thought. Everybody else is like, no, Charlie, this is fine. We're good. After 50 takes, we should be fine. Really, Charlie. He was a perfectionist, and a bit of a challenge to work with. This is something he became known for in his career. Modern Times is another great one. Now keep in mind, as these films were being released in the late 1920s or early 30s, the rest of the Hollywood scene was moving on to talkies. All of his former silent movie era pals had suddenly found their voices and were speaking on film. Now, not all of them sounded great, but they did it anyway. Charlie refused. How could the Tramp possibly speak? He never had spoken before. Never. It wouldn't be right. Because the Tramp didn't speak. He was universal. Every country in the world could get behind the Tramp. China understood him. Russia, France, Italy, Spain. They all loved the Tramp because he didn't speak any language. But when he finally did speak, not only was it the end of the Tramp, but it was the end of Charlie's silence when it came to political issues. In the 1930s, someone who looked eerily similar to Chaplin was causing a good deal of trouble in Germany. Both Chaplin and Adolf Hitler were born the same year, only days apart. They both understood poverty at a young age. They both loved an audience, and their audiences loved them. Chaplin could see what Hitler was up to, and decided that the first words his little Tramp would utter would not just be a mockery of Hitler, but also a cry for mankind to rise up against what that fucking asshole was and what he stood for. The result was the film The Great Dictator, which began filming when Great Britain declared war on Germany and was released in October of 1940. At first, Chaplin had doubts about whether or not he should even do this film. It essentially made fun of a fucking madman who wanted to kill Jews, gays, gypsies, and really anyone who stood in his way. The Nazis even referred to Chaplin as Jewish, to which he replied, quote, "All geniuses have some Jewish blood in them." But he would sometimes refuse to deny being Jewish, since to do so, he said, would play directly into the hands of anti-Semites. Even President Franklin Delano Roosevelt said he had to get this film out. So, in the film, which mocks Hitler and fascism, Chaplin plays both a Jewish barber and a dictator named Adenoid Hinkle. And eventually, the poor barber is mistaken as the dictator. And this is where the famous final speech comes in. The most powerful speech in a film, I think. Go look it up on YouTube. It's deep, it's powerful, and more people should probably revisit it today. Like, for real. Go check it out. Anyway, this speech and this film officially end the Tramp's run in Chaplin's history. In fact, his next films, Monsignor Verdot, Limelight, and A King in New York, don't do as well, since the Tramp and that humor that the world fell in love with were gone. By 1947, Chaplin was being accused of being a communist. J. Edgar Hoover, you know, that guy, was after Chaplin. In fact, he was after all of the major stars in Hollywood, really anybody he didn't like. Hoover was an ass, and a thorn in Chaplin's side, and the FBI would do whatever they could to take him down, even enlisting the help of Hedda Hopper, a Hollywood writer with a well-read newspaper column. She was helping the FBI by writing crazy stories and getting a woman named Joan Barry to play along by stating that her son that she had was actually Chaplin's. This led to several court battles and really did a number on Chaplin's reputation. Even in the middle of all of this, 52-year-old Chaplin fell in love with another teenager. Oh, buddy, what are you doing? Well, this teenager, Una O'Neill, strangely, this marriage worked out. They had lots of children, and Una seemed to keep him somewhat grounded. And they were happy. And this is the only marriage that would last. However, between all of the criticism, the FBI attacks, the scandals, Chaplin was being pushed away by the country that had once loved him. And as the Chaplin family were heading overseas in 1952, the United States decided to kick him out of the country. You see, he had never bothered to become a full citizen of the United States, so they just had to wait for him to leave on some trip. And he got the message while sailing across the ocean to England that he couldn't come back. So he didn't. He claimed that he wasn't angry about what happened, but he clearly was. He probably could have come back if he wanted to, just apply for re-entry. They probably would have given it to him if he had apologized for his communist sympathies, but he was clearly bitter and wanted nothing to do with it. He sold his studio in California, and he moved to Switzerland, where he settled in a lovely mansion with his wife and children. He only came back briefly at the end of his life, 20 years later, to accept an honorary award at the 1972 Oscars. A few years later, he was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II. In the early morning of Christmas Day, 1977, Chaplin died after suffering a stroke in his sleep. He was 88 years old. Interesting side note. There's a fabulous book that I'm reading. The title is Rest in Pieces by Bess Lovejoy. In it, you will find some amazing stories about what has happened to some of the world's most famous corpses, including Chaplin's, which was laid to rest in a cemetery that I cannot pronounce in Switzerland. And in March of 1978, the cemetery superintendent noticed that Charlie's corpse was in fact gone. Two dumbasses, I mean dumbasses, named Wardos and Ganiv decided to hold Chaplin's body for a $600,000 ransom from Una Chaplin, his wife. And she was all like, nope. You can keep my husband's corpse. I'm not giving you any money. Now, he would never negotiate with kidnappers when he was alive. He wouldn't stand for any such nonsense, so she wasn't about to either. But the cops convinced her to do it, just so they could catch them and stop them from pulling any more of this nonsense. So after 11 weeks of planning and trying to track phone calls, they finally narrowed it down to a bunch of public phone booths where they were making these calls from, and they caught these dumbasses. Yay! So anyway, they led the cops to a cornfield where they had buried Chaplin's remains. He was brought back to the cemetery where he had originally been buried, and this time his remains were covered in a ton of concrete. But the farmer who owned the field where the idiots had hid Chaplin's body decided to place a wooden cross there and decorated it with a cane in honor of the tramp. And it was said that Una would visit the site from time to time because it was so pretty. Kind of neat, huh? Anywho, that's the fun story of Charlie Chaplin. If you haven't seen any of his films, get on that. You can actually head over right now, to the Internet Archive, right now, and watch several of his early short films for free. Do it. Do it. Okay. Anyway, that's the story for this week, folks. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for watching another episode of All My Favorite People. Wait, hold the phone. I should say, thank you for listening, watching. What is this? Fucking television? Come on, Shannon, it's a podcast. Get your shit together. Thank you for listening to another episode of All My Favorite People Are Dead. Catch you next time. All my favorite people are dead. All my favorite people are dead. I'm saying all